Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. Um, I'm Henry Jenkins, co-host of How Do You Like It So Far podcast, and welcome to the second day of the power and pleasure of podcasting. This year, we're celebrating the explosion of new creativity that's represented by radio and audio fiction. We're going to begin with a brief acknowledgement. So we acknowledge that USC was built on the sacred land of the Tongva, Chumash, and Kiz people. The colonization of this land reflects the systems of power upon which this country was founded and which continue to operate today. We honor all Indigenous people, past, present, and future, and their continued survival and contributions to our society. Oops. We also honor the legacy of the African diaspora and recognize that this country would not exist without the free enslaved labor of Black people. We know that contemporary struggles for Black lives are connected to our history of violence and white supremacy. We're particularly troubled tonight by the inexcusable violence and hate against Asian American and Pacific Islander community. We share these acknowledgments to pay respect to the original caretakers of this land, to raise awareness about histories that are too often erased or forgotten, to recognize our place in this history, and to affirm our commitment to social change. We are joined today by three extremely knowledgeable speakers. The first is Neil Verma, who was an assistant professor of sound studies in the Department of Radio, Television, and Film in Northwestern University. And he's the author of Theater of the Mind, Imagination, Aesthetics, and American Radio Drama, the co-editor of Anatomy of Sound, Norman Corwin, and Media Authorship, and the co-editor of Indian Sound Cultures, Indian Sound Citizenship, which came out last year from Michigan. Second scholar on the panel is, sorry, I'm trying to, oops, got too many windows up in here. All right, is Kathy Fuller Seeley, who is the William P. Hobby Centennial Professor of Media Studies in Radio, TV, Film Department of the University of Texas at Austin. She is the author of a recent book, Jack Benny and the Golden Age of American Radio Comedy, as well as an edited collection of the lost radio scripts from Jack Benny, which both came out last year. She's also being featured this week and next on my blog at henryjenkins.org, talking about Jack Benny and his impact on American broadcasting. And third up, we have Alina Fernandez Collins, who is, among other things, one of the hosts of the Radio Drama Revival, a show that I love to listen to. And she writes a bi-weekly newsletter about audio fiction, Audio Dramatic, where she reviews episodes and provides essays and news for the community. So, just a sec, we will get started. We're going to try to take you through a trajectory of the history of this form that I think we're all excited about. We could call it the rise, the fall, and the revival of audio fiction. And this trip will take us roughly 40 minutes, and then we will open it up for about 15 to 20 minutes of questions from the audience. So be formulating your questions. I promise you I will get to you. And if you want to go ahead and post them, we will capture them as we go along. So what conditions and circumstances led to the emergence of the so-called golden era of American radio? Give us some historical context here.
Maybe I can start with that and then pass it along to my co-panelists. So, to think about the origins of American radio drama, you also have to think about the origins of American radio. That's a complicated story. It involves a bunch of inventors, people you've probably heard of, Marconi, Tesla, people like that. Devices, the Audion is really important, for instance, carrying human voice, and then pieces of legislation. And government supervision of the airwaves. So the story of American radio drama really starts after World War I, when the monopoly over airwaves passes from the Navy into the commercial sector. And so the government issues licenses for people to have their own radio stations. And there's a kind of push and pull that goes on for 10, 15 years about how this is going to be structured. And it ends up being structured around kind of the model you probably all are familiar with, individual local stations of, generally low power. And then these end up getting affiliated into big networks. So that becomes NBC, CBS, things like that. So this is the period when American radio drama is kind of invented. The first audio drama that we know about, or a drama that was written for the radio, so that's different from something like performing an opera on radio or reading a Shakespeare script. That is, we think, was broadcast by WGY Schenectady in 1922. This is one of the first kind of point to mass type situations of broadcasting. This is what starts happening in front of 19 or so until 1924. This is the period where we start getting radio stations that are, not just transmitting from one place to another place, but from one place to many places. And so that's kind of the early history. And in the 20s, you get a lot of kind of these early storytelling programs. There's a whole format of kind of a local celebrity or a local raconteur telling stories and reading from fiction, that kind of stuff. And then in the late 1920s, early 30s, we start getting the forms that all of you probably will be familiar with. So comedy formats, early soap operas, Clara Lou and M here in Chicago, people like Eddie Cantor and Jack Benny eventually, and a bunch of imports from places like vaudeville, but also from minstrelsy, the most widely heard radio drama of the early 30s is unfortunately true, is the Amos and Andy show, which was listened to by something like a third of the listening nation at that time. And so that's kind of how audio drama emerges. It emerges as part of the building of these giant national audiences. And I think that's probably the key to thinking about this whole period, the classical period, is that what was created technologically, legislatively, socially, was really an audience. And these audiences were the things that helped define the structure of what these dramas were, who they were for, how they were made. And so I think that's the way to kind of think about it, not so much just where did the format come from, because it came from a lot of different places, or what made that possible, but the fact that there was this big, large body of listeners out there about whom we didn't really know a lot, to be honest with you, but we knew that they were listening, and that was how what helped define the medium during its growing period.
Can I jump in and say, from the listener point of view, how what an amazing invention radio was in about the 1920s. There's been, all human civilizations have loved to share stories, whether it's around the fireplace or the fire, whether it was somebody reading out of a book to everybody else in the family. There's something about sort of shared stories that all humans have loved so much. And even back in the 1880s, Edward Bellamy's novel, Looking Backward, one of the most interesting things he hoped for 100 years in the future was this idea of breaking the loneliness and silence of people sort of living alone and isolated in houses. And that's sort of what historians have learned that radio was able to mean to people. Suddenly you can have music and, and sort of noise and people talking at you or sharing stories with you nearly 24 hours a day. And so over and over again, listeners said how much comfort people like isolated on farms in the Midwest would say, the radio gave me, I felt like I had friends. It was the intimacy of somebody sort of talking, holding conversations or telling stories, or even just the weather reports, making those kind of connections. And so it's a tremendous technological advance to fill every household. Now, in America, that came at the national level with commercial radio. So you get these wonderful stories and these blaring commercials. So the wonderful invention comes with a sort of Pandora's box of things that were frustrating to many people because there was no way, you couldn't just click past the commercials. All you could do was twist the dial. So especially in America, nationwide radio grew up with tremendous quality because all these shows were being sponsored by advertisers, by manufacturers who wanted to sell you their Lucky Strike cigarettes or their Lux soap or things like that. So every good thing, this amazing media that can tell stories and bring you music and personal connections, excuse me, is going to come. This is back in the day with these annoying, as I said, commercials that you couldn't get rid of. So in America, we get to sort of celebrate the ingenuity while kind of declaiming the limitations.
Our friend capitalism. My co-host has basically covered everything here, but I'm just going to do a quick fun fact that I learned, which is that when Amos and Andy was running, movie theaters would pause showing movies so that during the Amos and Andy slot, so that people would go listen to it, because otherwise they would never have anyone staying for movies if they ran a movie through that slot.
But it's incredible power of this new national audience.
Yeah.
And, you know, like it's really hard to overstate the kind of experiential stuff that Kathy's talking about. I mean, at this time, most of the country is rural, right? Most of the country is just getting electricity for the first time. And so the stories we have is that when electrification comes, the first thing people buy is a light bulb. Second thing they buy is an iron. And the third thing they buy is a radio. And so this is a real kind of transformation in just the texture of everyday life. You know, and it's mostly a rural country. It's incredibly segregated, and it's, you know, mostly a regionally centered country. So the very small amount of time when the broadcast model, the kind of American system that Kathy described, ruled, you know, that this is the world that it was overtaking for a lot of folks.
And I think one of the things that, so I am also a podcast critic, right? So I do audio critique online. And one of the things from this era that is definitely true is that there was radio criticism, right? People wrote articles about what they thought about these things, right? The Philadelphia Courier, which was one of the African-American newspapers at the time, wrote a blistering critique of Amos and Andy that was much deserved. Even though it was one of the most popular things at the time. But if you don't know, Amos and Andy, as Neil mentioned earlier, was a minstrelsy show. Basically, it was about these Black characters being voiced by white people, by two white people, and it was incredibly popular. And as you can imagine, dear God, but you know, they had it, and this, like, the existence of this critique now is actually quite rare. Which is very interesting. And I think, you know, we'll get to this part of like the downfall of radio that helped lead to also the consequentially the downfall of like audience and journalistic critique of the media.
So Neil, this is a totally unfair question because you've written multiple books on the subject, but can you give us some sense of the aesthetics of classic radio drama? What, as people are listening to this stuff maybe for the first time, what should they be listening for?
I took some notes on this question because I'm a pro. But I think what I'll do is I'll leave the kind of comic tradition for Kathy to talk a little bit more about, because she knows so much more about that than I do. And by all means, Elena, Kathy, fill in here. But I thought it would be useful to kind of structure this and to kind of lay it out in kind of 3 or 4 different kind of traditions that kind of are through lines right from the classical age until today. So in the 1930s, this is kind of the crucible when a lot of the formats that we think about were first invented. So kind of soap operas, things like Clara, Lou and M and the Goldbergs, and horror shows like Lights Out and The Witch's Tale in New York. a lot of the comedy formats, these kind of big anthology shows. You've probably heard of Orson Welles's Mercury Theater on the Air, the CBS Workshop, maybe. If you kind of step back from all of these different formats that flourish here, another one is the crime thriller gangbusters, Calling All Cars, shows like that. If you step back from that, you really have a bunch of different people who are experimenting with different ways of telling stories that move through space and time in these really interesting ways. And so that's kind of, to me, the aesthetic of the 30s, is that this is a time when radio dramatists are really thinking about, how do we create perspective? How do we move someone from one scene to another? How do we create a show that's all self-contained in 1 hour? Or how do we do one that is going to stretch across a whole saga length from decade to decade? A lot of these questions are being kind of figured out in the 1930s. And then from there, from that kind of crucible, I think emerges basically from the drama side, not so much from the comedy side, sort of basically four traditions. So one of these is something like a thriller tradition, right? So many of you who have heard some classical radio dramas, many of you have probably heard things like Sorry, Wrong Number and shows like that are suspense programs. These are rooted to some extent in Lights Out and The Witch's Tale, but they become really big in the 1940s. Shows like Suspense, the Mole Mystery Theater, you might have heard of, but they continue all the way to today. Black Mass in the 1960s, Eric Bauersfeld's show, Nightfall and Vanishing Point in the 1980s. These are Canadian thriller shows. Video Palace is very much in this tradition. And sort of, you can think of those connected to detective shows, mystery thrillers, and adjacent genres like science fiction westerns. What do they have in common? What happens in a lot of thrillers is innovation when it comes to narrative structure. So, for example, in the 1940s, one of the things that happens very often is like the invention of the internal retrospective character narrator. Dear listener, something terrible has happened to me. I'm about to tell you how it all started. And then you segue to the back and start telling the story. So that's kind of one tradition, sort of the thriller tradition, which is a place where a lot of narrative structures get worked out. The second I think of as more of like a writerly tradition. A lot of kind of famous authors worked in radio throughout their careers. Archibald MacLeish is one I write about. Arthur Miller, Ray Bradbury. You probably know a little bit about the kind of British golden age, people like Beckett, Harold Pinter, Tom Stoppard, Joe Orton. This tradition kind of intersects in some ways with kind of outsider, feminist, anti-colonial writers. Langston Hughes wrote a great radio play. Sylvia Plath wrote one that not most people know about. Bertolt Brecht, Severus Sarduy in Cuba. There's a number of South African playwrights who created work on Radio Zulu. And so these are often kind of people from the theater or literary world who are working in the medium, often kind of cloaking social critiques thereby, and often in anthology shows. So these are people who will write one script for one particular show and won't necessarily make a career out of it. Often these are hard to find. So that's the second tradition. A third, I think, is kind of a high concept. We would describe it as a high concept tradition now. Big, flashy, exciting, sometimes expensive shows. I Love a Mystery by Carlton Morse is a good one from the classical age. But I also think of like the Firesign Theater, ZBS, some of ZBS's network, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which is a program that brings a lot of people into the field. Some of the Star Wars shows, which actually were made at USC, and even producers like Yuri Rosovsky in the 1990s, some of Fred Greenhalgh's work. The inheritor of this is probably Dirk Maggs, who makes radio dramas that are often have really big casts. He collaborates a lot with Neil Gaiman. He just did a recent Sandman series. Oh, I'm on the phone. I can't talk right now. I have to open a banana. So there's this kind of high concept thing, and many of you will probably know shows like Limetown, Homecoming, Blackout, shows that kind of want to be TV series. And that I would kind of fit very much in these. Like they sound a lot like the TV series. And what's exciting about these is that they can often bring like real technical innovation. So early stereophonic audio dramas, for instance, are like this, binaural audio dramas. They're amazing at world building. They sometimes have the best sound effects. And then there's this kind of experimental tradition, which goes back to people like Orson Welles, the CBS Workshop, kind of auteur directors and writers like Norman Corwin, who taught at USC, Arch Oboler, John Tiedemann in the UK, Eric Bauersfeld in the 1960s. Some more recent names you might know: Gregory Whitehead, Joe Frank, The Truth, which is a podcast done by Jonathan Mitchell. I think Caitlin Prest is a good example of this as well. She does a podcast called The Heart. And these are all rule breakers. There are people who are bringing in kinds of things you're not supposed to have in audio dramas, like sex and gender and technical things like Orson Welles often made radio plays that are incredibly slow. Caitlin Prest is doing great work and stuff that's like verite style, incredibly difficult to record. So I feel like those are sort of some through lines to think about from the classical age to today. And there's a lot of stuff kind of in the donut hole between that kind of link these things together. The podcast boom has its own kind of aesthetics as well, and I'll let my colleagues talk a little bit about that. But to me, if I'm looking for kind of what are some arcs, a thriller tradition for sure, a writerly tradition, a kind of high concept one, an experimental one. Those are the ones that I tend to follow.
So, Kathy, take us through a little bit of what's going on in comedy during the same period.
Sure. In this same period, comedy was much more dependent on live audience response and liveness. It simply amazes me that dramas could be done live, but it's my guesstimate, and you could tell me absolutely that I'm wrong, that more dramas were done without audiences. Certainly soap operas were done on the cheap without audiences, but comedies were very much, and I'm talking here, Bob Hope, Jack Benny, famous variety show comedians really wanted that give and take with the audience there at the performance. And scholars talk about the ways that then listeners at home felt like they were sort of drawn in and interacted with the show in that way. That'll be a little bit different from a drama, which I think is so intimate to the ear. They're all fascinating. But the problem with the comedy was that it didn't grow and change much. The very best comic, many people say, was a fellow named Fred Allen, who was all about sort of snarky contemporary jokes about ridiculous things going on. They were so commercialized, if you will. They could not talk like our late night talk show hosts about contemporary issues, anything of importance, because they were so constrained by their commercial sponsors. But it was that they did represent a major portion of primetime radio broadcasting, a significant amount. And sometimes it would be comedy evenings and then dramatic evenings. So the few programmers there were trying not to mix things up too much, because they wanted audience to have a sort of continuing emotional feeling about what's going on. But I'd be very curious, because I'd be very curious to know which podcasts today are done in front of live audiences. I'm sure, Prairie Home Companion has for a long time. And there are positives and negatives about it. But that's, to me, the biggest difference.
Yeah. To answer this idea of like the live audiences, live shows in podcasting really started picking up as like a general concept for what you could do to earn some money, as well as bringing your show out of the airwaves and to your audience, like in person. Started picking up maybe sometime around like 2017, right? Welcome to Night Vale, of course, has an incredibly popular run, right? So do the multitude of shows. Right, exactly. Someone just left this, that technically the Thrilling Adventure Hour was done in front of a live audience, right? We had a bunch of, wait, don't tell me, right? Yeah. But when it comes to dramas that are very popular in podcasting, very few of them are done in front of a live audience. And the ones that are heavily influenced by classic radio drama. And it's very obvious in like the aesthetics of the sound, like the feel of classic radio drama is very much in place, also in the aesthetics of and the development of their plot lines, and the way that they do those things. So
Thank you. That's so interesting.
Just on the topic of the audience, if any of you ever do go back and listen to some of these broadcasts, I think you'll be really interested in how the audiences react to different things that the performers do. There's a famous sketch, for example, that Mae West and Don Amici did, where Mae West, it takes place in the Garden of Eden, and Mae West, being Mae West, made it a very suggestive, kind of sexually charged exchange. But there's nothing in the actual words that make you think that. It's all in the way that the audience reacts to it. And actually, it ended up being Mae West was something like banned from radio for like 10 years or something because of this. But of course, this was great publicity for her. It's totally her brand. But yeah, the audiences of classic radio dramas are really fascinating to listen to.
So I know it's a complex picture on the one hand and a simple one on the other, but what happens to this golden age of radio fictions?
Capitalism.
Why does it end? Capitalism escapes everything for sure. Television would be obviously the other big term, but can we nuance those two things a bit?
Well, I'll just say the big time comedy shows were among the first to go to television because the television networks were the radio networks. And so indeed capitalism winning here because the bean counters found that the commercial connection, that if your show, even though television was expensive and it was only like on the East Coast for a couple of years, any product advertised on television was being bought at an even greater amount than anything advertised on radio. So it was this push for the visual, for that other connection that they thought audiences had. And so lots of the comedians went over to television, but several of them, like Fred Allen, his comedy was so oral and cerebral that he never found a way to move. And Jack Benny was terrified of it because so much of his comedy of the ear, that he was really terrified. And the early critics said, oh no, you're just a radio show on television. You're not using the new abilities of the new medium. And what those critics wanted were Milton Berle's and Sid Caesar's and Jerry Lewis's, who would do a lot of visual slapstick. So I'm curious what it's like on the dramatic side, but the coming of television killed big time comedy radio, but leaving plenty of room for people like Bob and Ray.
Well, it is a complicated story, and it's also easy to overblow it. Like there are great radio dramas made in every decade from 1920 until today. Great, right? Really, and like stuff that's worth studying and learning about. But what changed was a kind of discursive position, like the idea that, oh, this is a dead medium now, which really starts in the mid 50s, and it's only at that time that people thought of it that way. That doesn't change the fact that there were radio dramas being made, and it's also true that like there's a perpetual state of revival. Radio drama revival has been around for what, 12 years, something like that.
14.
Maybe 14 years. And in that time, how many headlines have you seen that said this show means radio dramas were being reborn?
Who invented audio fiction this time?
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, totally. And so there's this incredible, I think the way to think about it is that in the mid 1950s, what happens is this audience we've been talking about moves to television and is moved to television by capitalist companies, right? Deliberately. That doesn't mean radio goes away. This is also like the most fertile time in the history of BBC radio dramas, exactly this time, and so, the audience moves, but the medium continues. But what settles in is this odd kind of discursive paradox that comes back every couple of years, where someone will say, guess what? We're reinventing audio drama. It's going to be Theater 5 on ABC, or it's going to be Earplay for NPR, or it's going to be all these shows that Gimlet makes, that somebody's going to reinvent it. But don't worry, it's not going to be like the old stuff. It's going to be brand new. We're going to be doing it in this new way you've never heard of. So, it's when this kind of paradoxical sense that radio drama is totally dead, but also brand new. When that sets in is really in the 1950s, but it's really a kind of cultural choice that is a way of framing what is essentially an economic decision. How do we move this audience from the radio world to the television world? But from the producer point of view, from the point of view of like people making excellent, interesting work, it doesn't stop. There is no death of radio drama, right? It just continues, and it isn't. It shows up in CDs and on records and on specialized radio stations and on campus radio stations and in tapes that people exchange from one another, or on the BBC overseas. It still lives. It's just that it is in this weird kind of half-life. So I think the moment where it becomes plausible to say that this is a rebirth, that's the moment where you know something is dead. Like, you know something's dead when you have to bring it back from the dead. Put it that way.
All right,
Yeah.
so Elena, talk to us about this, the revival that the radio drama revival is about. What's happening right now and what's led up to it?
So Radio Drama Revival, as I mentioned, we're now in our 14th year, and it was founded by Fred Greenhalgh, who Neil mentioned a little bit earlier, very briefly, and it was founded on the radio. So Radio Drama Revival started as like a radio slot in Maine, and it wanted to talk about the fact that there are these incredible radio dramas, and talking about like some of the classics from the era, but also some of the newer things that kind of slip through the cracks. Like, oh my gosh, my brain is not letting me think. Styx. Who made Styx? Perez. It's fine. Names
Lopez. Tom Lopez.
Thank you.
Also known as Meatball Fulton.
Yeah. My brain just like, I'm not great at names, y'all. But talking about all of these things that have been made in order to get them an audience, yeah, right, throughout this recent period that, as Neil mentioned, discursively went out of fashion to talk about. So I mentioned, right, this sort of dearth of criticism. And so this dearth of criticism occurs, right? Public criticism of media, right, in a sphere where audiences could access it and wanted to access it, did no longer existed. You can find some of these things in academia, of course, but that's not, right, the same kind of sphere. And so Radio Drama Revival is about bringing back this attention to this form that actually never went away, but is now incredibly popular thanks to the advent of the internet, right? The internet and digital forms of not just being able to bring back these older sounds, these older audio dramas and comedies, so to find a new audience through the internet, but also to create these new stories, and to distribute them through the wonderful medium that is our digital era. And so Radio Drama Revival's focus has pretty much always been on the things that slipped through the cracks, right? Pretty much forever, and the things that would slip through the cracks, and now, if it weren't for the fact that we do have like a burgeoning criticism sphere, that if you want to become a critic, talk to me. Like, yeah, and so that's what it's hoping to do. And so it's focusing on these like independent productions, right, that are funded via Kickstarter or, you know, Indiegogo or crowdfunding through Patreon or things like that, or who get funded from like government grants. We've got a couple of those, and of course, so since 2020, there have been actually a lot more fiction podcasts that have been produced because of government grants from in the US, in the UK, especially in Australia and New Zealand. So I think that's really interesting, actually.
So let's talk about the aesthetics of podcast fiction as it relates to radio fiction. I mean, what changes? What remains the same? Is there a difference? People last night were talking about the intimacy created by the earbud versus the across the room radio or across the car radio. How significant is that in the ways people are thinking about radio fiction today?
Well, I can answer a little bit of this, and then my fellow co-hosts can also jump in. So one of the things that I will say is that the description of like intimate and intimacy has definitely by this point been kind of overplayed. It's sort of thrown around without any explanation of what it actually means for the sounds, and not just the sound, but the way that we access audiences. So when we say that like the earbud, right, or the headphones created intimacy, what we're talking about is that it created this one-to-one storytelling space, right, where someone is providing to you a story and you are the one accessing it, and it's only you, right? And it's this it's also the intimacy of literal space, so physical space of the earbud being right next to you, versus the radio being distant from you. So the radio was, of course, like a family tradition. You were sharing it with it was like a 1-2 group, right, audience ratio. So you were accessing the radio for the most part with your family, creating this shared story together in this singular space. And the shared story that we create in podcasting is one-to-one and then to group, because people end up talking about it online and creating communities around it. But first it has to go through this this middle point, right, where it reaches one person and then it'll go to the group, thanks to the internet. So I think that that's kind of like one of the primary ways that it is distinct in the way that it sort of filters and the way that story filters, because now we've got this extra filter that it's going through and this extra analysis that it's going through of like the singular person, and then going to the group and discovering all the other analyses and thoughts about the story that they've just listened to.
I think that's right. It made me think of there's a philosopher in England named Clive Cazot, and he has this article that he writes about the phenomenology of radio drama. And what he's trying to do is he's trying to explain what it is when we say, oh, I love radio because I get to imagine things. Actually, the things you imagine are just reifications of the choices that the broadcasters have made and the care that they put into putting you into sort of positions. But he talks about how radio has this invitational quality, right? How a radio is kind of inviting you into a certain thing. And I also think that what Elena's pointing out is that podcasting really invites you to do something, right? Invites you to like join a kind of conversation that's happening often in another medium. And that is really different to me. So I think that's a real importance. Some of it is also like, we don't think about it this way, but like the advent of digital audio workstations and DAWs has totally changed the way that audio dramas are made. Completely changed it, and like it's weird because it's something that has happening both in radio and in podcasting at the same time. But from someone who looks at it from the point of view of aesthetics, it's amazing how much more produced things are, but also how like digital audio workstations help you think about sound as like an object you can move around in space and time across a screen. And I feel like that has this like real residual effect on how the kinds of things that can be imagined now. The audiences are so much more diverse and so much more oriented towards like minoritarian cultures than it was ever true in radio, like ever. And I think that's a huge change. But there's also kind of just like, particular aesthetic fascinations that you can find across podcasts. I think a lot about this phenomenon I call audio position, which is basically where you are in the world of the fiction, right? And in classical audio drama, you're often kind of, segueing from place to place, or you're kind of following a body through deep space. That's sort of an intimacy effect to me. But in podcasts, you're often inside a recording device, right? And that's sort of where you are in the world of the story. And that's fascinating. It's fascinating that that's become such a pervasive trope across different forms of medium, and also that it's been so yielding and like a form that like allows you to tell a really wide variety of stories rather than being constricting. And so I feel like that's a big deal. And like stuff that, I spend a lot of time in my research listening to like monaural audio, right? So when I listen to anything like past 1970 and there's two different things happening in different ears, like my mind is blown, like the use of stereo is also, I think, a big element of it for me.
Well, I'm going to turn to audience questions in just a second. I think we will be able to unmute you, but it would be helpful if people raised your hands if you've got a question. And Meantime, I'm going to ask a kind of softball question. What would you recommend for people who wanted to start engaging with radio fiction, old or new? What would be a couple of top of mind recs for people out there? Kathy, you haven't talked in a while. Why don't we start with you?
Oh, truly, I would recommend to people who don't think they would like radio audio of the past to go to some of these large sites, whether it's archive.org or some put together by old time radio fans. Fred Allen is truly a joy, and Jack Benny has his moments. So that's I would say the best of the comedies is still pretty wonderful. So
for some classic radio that I love, quietplease.org. They have their own there's its own website where you can listen to all the episodes, and if you need something to start with, my recommendation is The Thing on the Forble Board. It is kind of like a dark comedy / horror, and it really taught me a lot about the use of silence in particular in audio. I would also recommend, we already mentioned Sorry Wrong Number from Suspense. That one was like classic thriller that ended up being really popular and doing a lot of really interesting things. But also 3 Skeleton Key on Escape. So Escape was a radio drama that featured, trying to escape death and, summarily failing and trying to escape like difficult situations that would end up with people, not being very like great. And 3 Skeleton Key is one of my favorites from that one. I think that they did the tension building in that episode is very good.
Okay. Neil?
Just an anecdote. So interesting about 3 Skeleton Key is that there's a version on Suspense and Escape. These are 2 sister shows, and they're both directed by the same person, William N. Robeson, and they both star Vincent Price. So what's interesting about this show is that you can hear one that's in like an adventure aesthetic on Suspense, and then one that's in a suspense aesthetic on the show Suspense. So they have 2 different scores. They use different sound effects. So it's a really interesting kind of genre exercise. But I like Elena, I would recommend Suspense as a show to kind of dive into. It's got a lot of connections to old Hollywood, but the people who made it were all like real professionals from the 30s. And then from there, you can kind of decide what direction you want to go. Like, do you want to learn more about kind of genre fiction in the 40s and 50s? Do you want to look more in the roots of some of these techniques? Do you want to look more into the future and see what people are doing now in kind of the suspense thriller genres? For something that's in between the classical and contemporary age, I really still think The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is so much fun, and like, it's really an enjoyable listen, and it sounds very modern and it sounds very forward looking. There's all kinds of interesting things that they're bringing from the the BBC Radiophonic Workshop, Delia Derbyshire and people like that. Really interesting stuff. And then for contemporary stuff, I think you couldn't do the Bright Sessions is a great place to start. I think my main advice is to listen to a ton of it. Don't just like listen to like 1 or 2 episodes and see whether or not you're into it, but like listen to like 50 episodes, because then you really get into the world of these creations, and you can really begin to appreciate what they're doing. Because I feel like if you listen to just one, it's very easy to like really get the idiom, and I just feel like you just this is the kind of thing where you jump into it. You don't sample things. That's my advice.
And if we want to like name a couple of other contemporary works that are doing really interesting things with the way that they are designing this audio, right? Neil mentioned Caitlin Prest. I would highly recommend that you check out the Mermaid Palace podcasts, which is an audio company that is founded by Caitlin Prest. Asking for It appearances are all like just absolutely incredible audio fictions that deal with specifically like real life issues and problems that regular people face, right? Asking for It is about queer domestic violence. Appearances is about the difficulties of being a first generation child of immigrants, and wanting to start a family, but start a family as a single mom, right? So I would highly recommend those for some contemporary sound.
And I will note that Visions and Voices has helped prepare a theme guide, handout guide, which has some of my recommendations of both classic and contemporary radio fiction, and some links to them as well. So check that out. So Seth, you're up first. I think you have to unmute yourself.
I'm unmuted now.
Okay.
First off, I just wanted to say thank you to the four of you for having this discussion. I grew up listening to old, like, radio programs through my uncle, and I started with shows like Jack Benny and Miss Brooks and like The Shadow and stuff, and then I sort of dived into Inner Sanctum and Suspense, and there's so many different varieties of stories that were told around that time. And then, like you guys were discussing a moment ago about kind of the evolution and experimentation of like radio from like the 60s to even like the 90s. My question was, that I've been I've been diving into a lot of, I guess what you would call like the modern audio fiction, like the current audio fiction. And what I found interesting was some of them, like I was listening to Carrier the other day through Gimlet. And what's interesting with like that particular series is most of it takes place inside a truck, and it's a first-person narrative. The main character is a truck driver, and most of the situations take place inside the truck. And there's a couple of other modern ones that where like you kind of think about where it's almost like the writers thought about where the listener might be while they're listening to the show. And so they can kind of immerse themselves into that situation easily. So I just want to see if you guys had any thoughts on that, on kind of like that immersion and kind of thinking about that from the ground up when people develop their audio dramas.
Yeah, one of the recommendations that sound designers and producers always give online and during their discussions about how they produce this work is that one of the ways that you need to test is you need to test the audio on the lowest quality speaker that you have access to, in order to account for people who listen to this stuff while driving, which I think is actually quite an interesting feature, right, of doing this sound design work, because you have to think about realistically the ways that people are going to be listening to your work. And if you want to immerse them into, right, this other world, you need to be conscious of the fact that you might be immersing them while they're driving. And that could be very dangerous, right? So I know a lot of podcasts that before the episode starts, they tell you if there are sounds of driving or sounds of like car sounds that could startle you. So that's actually another interesting quirk. But I think that's one way that that's one like technical way that people deal with that.
Thank you.
So could we expand his question a little bit and think about immersion and reflexivity, which we might think we're at odds with each other, but so many of the podcasts are fictions about making podcast or use the podcast format to think about it. It's as if we went back to our roots and Orson Welles' War of the Worlds and construct the fiction around the medium. And that seems to be both calls attention to the medium and has that sense of immersion because we're using the medium itself. As Neil mentioned, Video Palace falls into this category. So do you have any thoughts about that, the tendency of reflexivity in so many contemporary fictional podcasts?
Well, I mean, to me, one really easy way of talking about the difference between classical radio drama and contemporary radio drama is that one is broadcast live and one is recorded. That's not really true. People in the classical age made a lot of recordings and they used a lot of recorded sounds. Often, you know, if you see photos of them, you'll see people that they look like DJs because they'll have a couple of record players with different sound effects on them, and they kind of would spin them like that. And then today, you know, we have this whole tradition of creating live versions of the shows. That is an important economic part of it as well. So, you know, it's not really true, but you know, it's hard to get away from the fact that, you know, this is a kind of reflection on the ontology of the medium, that like the ontology has shifted from one of like spatial dissemination to one of like temporal encoding, right? And maybe that connects to the way that we time shift when we listen to these things. Nobody all listens to it at the same time. Maybe it connects to the way that, you know, we interact with it through a screen. Michelle Hilms, who's a well-known historian of radio drama, she talks about how, you know, we live in the age of screen radio. And I think there's something really to that. So, you know, I think, you know, there's such an invitation to like reflect on that thematically. And a lot of people take that up.
I would also just throw in a note here also that this reflexive like framework, right? Because it is a framework of a way that they are producing this content, is also a result of the fact that you can make this stuff by yourself. You don't need you know, a whole team of people. And a lot of the times people want to tell their stories, right? And tell the things that they are you know, share these stories with a wider audience. That is my cat scratching my chair. Stop that. But they don't have the resources to make the full like cast version that they are interested in making, or they don't have not the full cast version, but maybe like the stuff with full sound effects, right? And soundscaping. Right. And so they create this reflexive, creating a podcast or recording a diary entry or things like that in order to tell the story. And it's a framework that comes out of necessity in order to share your story when you are working within a certain set of constraints. And I think that that's really important to keep in mind when you come across these stories, that they are doing it in the way that they can.
Okay. Wagner, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce your name, but you're up next.
Oh God.
Yeah, thank you. Wonderful session. I mean, a lot of questions that I have. Primarily, I mean, one of the panelists mentioned that audience defined the structure of what the format actually is. And my question kind of surrounds around the role of the changing audiences that we have and the changing listeners that we have. So while we see that the changing form of media keep changing, but the format is always there. So how do you see the changing role of audiences and listeners, and how it kind of impact the medium itself and the format itself?
Yeah.
Well, I'd just like to say something that fascinates me about modern listening to radio of the past. That we also confront very much when visual dramas, this is the Netflix problem, right? Or the Netflix issue that you can binge watch something, you can binge listen to something. But when I'm talking about my old shows, I mean, they're not mine, old shows, you know, from back in radio in the day, it was very much, they were only on once. You couldn't re-listen to them. It was appointment radio. You had to be there at the time, and there wasn't a physical record of it. So it impresses me back in the day how much dedicated fans had to keep in their heads. You had to remember those characters. You had to bring all that with you. And then in speaking to people who were longtime fans of the past, to approach their memories. What did they think they remembered? that happened. All this change with old radio, because it was actually radio fans of these old shows, not in any way the producers or networks or sponsors or the performers themselves that gathered these things up. I very much like to ride around in my car. I commuted for many years to listen to 700 episodes of Jack Benny's show. See, I'm trying to take Neil at his word and not just sample. But it did occur to me that I was experiencing these shows very differently than their original audiences were. And it's interesting then to think about, what do I know more or better? What connections can I make because of the way I can see this now versus trying to put myself in the place of people that back then. So it's just, it's another interesting issue to think about, as you see, the great questions you've raised about between audiences and how we experience the medium.
I think that drawing from that, so we are in, right, this massive digital era. And so one of the things that exists are things like subreddits and community spaces, right, that are specifically geared towards discussions by fans about these works. Right, the Magnus Archives has a huge, enormous fan base and active subreddit and Discord server, right? So servers where people can interact live about these things, and are also very popular. Discord is very popular with fiction podcasters. And the impact that this has is, of course, depending on what we're talking about, right? The creators might have some kind of access to these things, right? They might be active in the subreddit, they might be in the Discord, some don't. They might be active in a fan Discord, but they also might not be, right? Because one of the other things that I think is really interesting is the way that we don't that we try to demarcate a line between fan spaces and creator spaces. And so that's a very interesting concept, right? Because the fans develop, headcanons and fandom content, right? Art, stories, fan fiction, and their own theories and ideas, right? But they can do that in relative, I don't want to say safety from, but relatively more sequestered from creators for that kind of work, because creators understand that having a fan space in the digital era is actually quite important, and in order to create this shared mythology about stuff, and its impact is, of course, that you're going to grow your community that way, right? With the more people that are talking about your show and creating artifacts and things about your show, that's going to interest somebody else who might be looking for that community. They'll be like, oh, I can come over here and I can talk about, how I think the Magnus Archives is going to end. And so I think that that's, the way of building community at its base just has completely changed from how they did it in the classical radio era time.
I agree with everything that's been said. I guess one way to think about the evolution of audio drama over its history, 100 years or so, is as a series of kind of new audiences that it finds, right? And sometimes they're giant and sometimes they're small, but they're both, whether they're big or small, they're still important. And often that shapes the kinds of material that's being made and who it's being made for and how. There's other ways of thinking about it. There's technological innovations, particular, great artists and things like that. But audiences are really what ends up mattering really in the sweep of things. And so for example, right now in the pandemic, there's a lot of theater companies, like stage theater companies, that are getting interested in making audio drama, which makes sense because they have a lot of people who are desperate to create and aren't able to do it because they can't be in a room with people. And so I'm curious to know whether or not the kind of audiences that those productions will bring into the medium, whether or not those audiences will articulate well with the same kinds of audiences that were brought in kind of during the podcast boom over the last 10 years. So, this is like, I think if you're interested in making it, that's something to follow. Like, where are the new audiences that are getting interested in this medium, and how are they doing it? What are some techniques that are being employed? I think that's something to keep track of.
All right, well, with that, we need to wrap things up. There's a bit of a break, 30 minutes, I think, before the next segment. And Colin McClay will be my co-host on How Do You Like It So Far. We'll be moderating a discussion with the producers of Bright Session and of Video Palace and Daughters of DC, talking precisely about the industry and conditions of production at the current moment. So if come back for that in just a few minutes. Thanks very much to everyone involved with this, including particularly the folks at Visions and Voices and the folks at the Annenberg School of Communication and Journalism who made this event possible. So thank you very much.